Stort tack och hjärtligt välkomna. I will continue in English, I think. I could do in Swedish, but maybe I would lose half of the audience, and I'm sorry I can't do Icelandic. So I could hear that the ministry has a very ambitious time plan. You are working on preparing the draft electronic communications code, and my task for this afternoon to explain briefly, in broad strokes, what this new electronic communications code implies, and what are the key changes it actually brings to the current, to existing regulatory framework. A few words about the aims and the policy context, and then some of the key provisions. As you know, the code is quite extensive, so I don't have an ambition to cover within those 40 minutes all the main provisions of the code, but just a few innovations or the few new things that will change life of PTA, of the regulator, and life of the market players once those provisions are put in place. So it's about market analysis and more specifically the new remedies, the new tools that are given to the regulator in the context of this code, specifically in terms of access regulation and in terms of co-investment provisions, provisions that actually aimed to create incentives for investment in very high-speed communications network, and also possibility for sharing or co-sharing risks between different players when they invest in high-speed networks. That was the Commission intent. On spectrum management, a few words about end-user rights and the over-the-top players, bringing some of the over-the-top players subject to the same rules as other providers, providing equivalent services, and a few words on universal service. So in terms of the policy context, one thing to remember is that the review of the regulatory framework that the European Commission has launched in 2016 was not actually the goal in itself. It was not recast of regulatory framework for the sake of recasting the regulatory framework. It was pursuing far more ambitious goals in the context of the digital single market strategy that the European Commission launched in 2015 in a broader framework of the digital agenda for Europe. And the targets, the objectives announced by the European Commission back in 2015, they were based on three pillars, essentially supporting access to online products and services, seamless access across all the borders for all users, for all consumers in the European Union, creating conditions for developing and deploying electronic communications network, digital networks and services, and also further conditions for enhancing digital European single market, digital market in Europe, enabling it to grow and prosper. So those three aims, three pillars, and a whole range of measures, of legislative proposals were announced or planned by European Commission at the same time as they announced it. Part of it was concerned with review of the Copyright Directive and other aspects about audiovisual services, privacy, lots of aspects. But among all, there was also a proposal to initiate, to open a quite dramatic review, reshuffle, recast of the rules that we have applying to electronic communication sector. So review was scheduled for 2016. And indeed, in 2016, the European Commission, in 2015, they launched the review, and September 2016, they released the proposals for review. And that was the start of quite a long legislative process going on for 2 years, which was completed in December last year. As we heard, in December last year, the Commission finally adopted the European Electronic Communications Code. This is just for you. Well, you probably know it all the way. Iceland has been going through all this way, starting from liberalization, and the European regulatory framework has undergone several stages, including the improvised review back in 2015, which resulted in the adoption of Roam Like at Home and net neutrality provisions. And I believe to a large extent, all those provisions, they are in place in the Icelandic legal system, except perhaps some provisions from 2009 regulatory framework. So, as I said, the review was not the goal in itself. There were two key policy objectives with the review. and two essential policy documents released by the European Commission at the same time as they published the review proposals were the Gigabit Society and the 5G Action Plan. What it entails, it essentially adds new connectivity goals on the top of those that we already have under Digital Agenda for Europe for 2020. Now it introduces new connectivity goals for 2025. So it means that by 2025, 100 megabits downlink speed should be available to all Europeans, rural or urban. It is technology neutral connectivity, but it's meant to be easily upgradable to gigabit speed. So we could say that essentially the European Commission here is talking about fiber connectivity. And on the top of it, 1 gigabit speed should be available to all main socio-economic drivers and digitally intensive enterprises, meaning hospitals, schools, libraries, they should have access to gigabit speed already by 2025. What about 5G? Well, there is also a set of targets set for 5G commercial launch, for commercial introduction, for commercial launch, and also by 2025, it's envisaged that there should be uninterrupted 5G coverage available in all urban areas and all major terrestrial transport paths. So quite ambitious plan, because if you think about it in European context, we have very, very divergent set of countries, 28 member states, finding themselves at a very different stages of fiber deployment, of deployment of mobile networks. So it was realized by European Commission from the very start that achieving those goals would require a lot of investment. On the European scale, it would amount to over 500 billion investment until 2025 to achieve those goals. So the idea with this new regulatory framework that the Commission proposed back in 2016 was actually to create regulatory framework that would support those goals, that would create investment incentives for market players to invest. And from institutional perspective, it now puts forward one new objective for policymakers and also for the regulators. On the top of traditional 3 objectives that we always had in the Framework Directive, in Article 8 Framework Directive, now we have Article 3, which basically corresponds to existing Article 8 Framework Directive, and it puts a new objective. On the top of promoting competition, contributing to development of the internal market, and promoting the interest of citizens, we now also have a new objective to promote connectivity and access to very high capacity networks, including fixed, mobile, and wireless. So now it's explicitly one of the tasks of the regulators, what they should strive to achieve. Well, regulators, European Commission, policymakers. So that's so much about the policy context and the goals, just explaining what the Commission is trying to achieve here. And now on the scope. Again, perhaps many of you, they're well familiar with the existing framework that we have. As you know, the core of the framework are the 5 directives: the Framework Directive, Access, Interconnection, Authorization, Universal Service, e-privacy. You have them all implemented into Icelandic law as well. Then there is BEREC 2009 regulation. I understand 2009 framework was not implemented in Icelandic law, but I heard that you'll jump into BEREC 2018 regulation immediately. Saves you time. And then there was also a range of implementing measures that were added on the top of those directives. Those are specific measures adopted by European Commission, considering Iceland being an EEA country rather than EU member state. Well, with some variations, they apply. Well, in Europe in the EU we have Article 7, with all regulatory decisions on market analysis notified to European Commission. Here you have ESA, the different body, but with the same role. Recommendation on relevant markets is being applied pretty much in line with what we have. Recommendation on termination rates, NGA, well, those are non-binding implementing recommendations, but they pretty much been closely followed. The European regulators, they had to take utmost account of those measures, and as they do. And progressively, since 2009, there were more and more regulations and directives added on the top of the 2009 framework. So, for example, to mention just one, the Broadband Cost Reduction Directive that appeared in the European framework in 2014, and it had to be implemented in 2016. And I understand there's been also debate going on here in Iceland about implementing it into Icelandic law. Then we had provisions, regulations on roaming, on telecom single market. Telecom single market essentially amounts to roam like at home and net neutrality, as I already said. Some provisions on funding, for example, Connecting Europe facility, essentially meant to create further financial instruments to support financing of broadband deployment, and then all the range of implementing measures. They probably all these measures to large extent look familiar to you because it's essentially the same framework that Iceland has been following with perhaps some differences or some delays in terms of implementation. So what is this recast is about? So we are going from 4 directives, framework, access, interconnection, authorization, universal service, to one single code. The 4 directives, they constitute the core of the code. We also have the 5th directive, the e-privacy directive, but this directive is still undergoing a separate review, as you know, and probably we will have another regulation. So on the top, as you know, the data protection directive was replaced by GDPR. So we already have general data protection regulation in the European Union. Here it would be something on the top, another regulation, but in terms of privacy rules in the electronic communication sector, rather than e-privacy directive, what we had so far. And then what we can anticipate, well, BEREC, as we already heard, well, BEREC regulation was amended. Now we have BEREC 2018 version of the regulation. And on the top of it, there is a huge task for the European Commission in terms of adopting, implementing acts. And also on BEREC, the role of BEREC will change in the context of the code, because BEREC would have a lot more active role in terms of advising the European Commission and the national regulators how to implement the rules put in the code. So lots of implementing measures from BEREC and from European Commission. And my colleague Matej will speak later about institutional changes. So on the top of all those new aspects, the European Commission has also proposed some institutional changes to support implementation of those new rules. Now, as I mentioned, one of the key aspects addressed in the code is the change to market analysis procedure. What has changed? What are the core changes in terms of procedural rules? Well, it's just the same principle. The market analysis process is still central, the main task of the regulator, but some periods or some procedures, they have changed. So, for example, the market review period, now the national regulators, they were required to carry out review every 3 years. Now this period will be extended to 5 years to give more certainty, more predictability to market players over a longer period of time. And then also in the context of these provisions, there is also a possibility for national regulators to approve even longer periods. Some measures, they could be approved by national regulators and apply even for longer periods, for say 7 years period. For example, you'll hear later, on co-investment commitments, or for example, specific commitments that were proposed by SMP operators in the context of vertical separation. In terms of consistent application of remedies, well, you may know that application of remedies, meaning the specific obligations that apply to operators with SMP, they have never been subject to veto by European Commission. So the European Commission, when it looks into draft measures proposed by national regulators in terms of market analysis, it can block, possibly, if it disagrees with the national regulators, it could block decisions on definition of the relevant markets and the scope of the relevant markets. It could block the decisions on designating specific SMP operators, but it has very little say in terms of remedies, in terms of specific obligations that the national regulators propose to apply. And the European Commission, what they initially wanted, they insisted the big problem towards achieving common market, applying remedies consistently, is the fact that the Commission has no control. So it was proposing to have a so-called double veto. So subject to condition that the European Commission and BEREC, the body of European regulators, agree that certain measures, certain remedies proposed by national regulators could be not consistent with the objectives of the common market, there could be a possibility to block those double lock veto mechanism. Well, that was a controversial aspect from the very beginning. And in the end, what we saw as the outcome of negotiations between European legislative bodies, it was that the double lock veto, it only applies in 2 instances. So it's possible for European Commission to block draft decisions on remedies by national regulators only in 2 cases. When we talk about co-investment procedures, and I explain a little more, it's rather complex, and also specific provisions, specific measures on symmetric access, meaning the measures that the European Commission, that the European regulators propose to apply to different market players regardless of their SMP. So even to non-SMPs, that could be rather intrusive measures, and therefore there is this screening procedure. And also only in exceptional cases to those symmetric remedies, the Commission could possibly block them. And I explain it in a little while when we talk about all those new remedies. One aspect which actually to some extent simplifies the market analysis work by regulators is actually that they do not have analyzed termination markets anymore. Fixed termination, mobile termination, it will be regulated by default at the EU level, and the European Commission will set single EU-wide caps for fixed termination rates and for mobile termination rates. Until now, as you know, all regulators across European Union, they had to analyze those markets, they had to find operators with SMP, and then they even had to develop cost accounting models to calculate the termination rates, or some of the regulators, like in Iceland, they would consider it too costly exercise, so they do some benchmarking exercise to come up with proper level of termination rates. All this will be gone. So now we will just have EU-wide termination rates. And those will be approved by European Commission by the end of December 2020. Another new aspect, which was actually not envisaged in the original proposals by European Commission, is regulating the retail prices related to intra-EU calls and SMS. So it was adopted in the very last moment in the process of just negotiations between Parliament, Council, European Commission, and now already from May 15, 2019, in European Union, we already have those caps. Mind you, they only apply to residential customers, to consumers, not to businesses. But the prices, the retail prices for intra-EU calls, for intra-EU international calls, now capped at 19 euro cents per minute for voice calls and 6 euro cent per minute for 6 euro cent per minute for SMS. In exceptional circumstances, national regulators may grant derogations. But you could see it's not very consistent with EU practice. It happened completely out of the traditional market analysis framework, but the rationale could be in the context of Roam like at home regulation. Since we have roaming rates regulation, then somehow it should be also consistent with the level of international calls across the EU. So that's sort of the bigger argument. Now a few words about probably the most contentious part of the code in terms of access remedies and provisions that are supposed to create incentives for incumbents and for new entrants, for alternative operators alike, to invest, to deploy high-speed capacity network, high-capacity network. So the objective from up front was to facilitate deployment of very high-capacity networks through increased infrastructure competition and creating more predictable regulatory environment for investment. Some adjustments to SMP access regime, so on the top of traditional asymmetric regulation, where obligations are only applied to SMP operators, now there is also a possibility to impose symmetric obligations that apply to all providers. but of course there are some exceptions. Some regulatory incentives for co-investment, which should enable regulators to remove some of the regulation or relieve some of the obligations imposed on S&P, subject to the conditions that they share risks, share investment risks with alternative operators willing to co-invest. And also more targeted, to some extent, S&P remedies. That's at a glance, the main changes to access regulation. Speaking about symmetric access obligations, basically you could find them all in Article 61.3 when we are talking about fixed networks. And what is it about? I would say, since a few months ago you had discussion about Broadband Cost Reduction Directive and implementing it in the Icelandic law. The provisions in the code, in a sense, they were meant by European Commission as provisions complementing the provisions of Broadband Cost Reduction Directive. So just like Broadband Cost Reduction Directive, they would apply, NRAs could apply them across various players, regardless of S&P, but primarily it is intended to facilitate access to wiring, cabling, and associated facilities inside buildings. So up to the first termination point inside buildings. Or possibly in some areas, like if we are talking about rural areas, that concentration point could be also located outside building. But this is basically up to the closest concentration point from the end user perspective. That's part of the network, essentially. Why? Because it's been recognized as in many countries, it still constitute a major bottleneck to reaching out the end users, for example, inside buildings. Usually you may have that the first operator not in all countries. I very well understand the Icelandic model. It's not that different from Swedish or Finnish model. But in some countries, it's very much the operator who connects apartments inside building, who owns all that infrastructure rather than housing company. And then that operator has kind of monopoly status. So then that could be the rationale for regulating access to that part of the network. I'm explaining a bit because it could be strange from Icelandic perspective, because I understand you don't have this issue here. But that was in Sweden, this is not an issue either, by the way. In many Nordic countries, it's not an issue, but in some countries it is. So it was meant to address that specific problem. Not further up in the network, but it basically applies to this part of the network where replication of network elements is economically inefficient. Well, think about the situation where each and every operator trying to reach end users inside a multi-dwelling unit and huge apartment block would build its own network. Think about nuisance it would create for people living there, all the sort of, it's economically, it's plain inefficient and impractical. So that's the sort of rationale. Mostly it's about tackling network replicability issues without compromising the existing S&P regime. So just to repeat, on whom those obligations could be imposed, could be electronic communication service providers, but could be also owners of wiring and cables. And there could be exemptions. So for example, smaller local projects or wholesale-only companies that are already offering some kind of open and non-discriminatory access, they could be explicitly exempted by regulators' decision. They could be exempted from applying those provisions. Up to where? As I already said, normally it would be up to the first concentration point, closest to the end user. But in certain circumstances, the regulator may choose to extend it, to extend the access obligation beyond the first concentration point, or impose some kind of active virtual access. But this type of remedies, they could only be applied if there are high and non-transitory barriers. And then also there are, from technical perspective, for example, it very much depends on network topology. And there is another economic dimension to it. It has to be an economically viable connection, access point. So it should host sufficient number of end user connections, for example. And because this measure is rather intrusive, there is also a requirement for this measure if the access point is being extended beyond the first concentration point, or if the access is imposed in the form of active access, then this measure would be subject to double lock veto mechanism, meaning the European Commission, if BEREC agrees, then it could block this measure, this type of remedy proposed by national regulators. And that would be subject to transparency, non-discrimination, and also appropriate cost sharing between the parties who are benefiting from this type of symmetric access. So that's the sort of the reasoning. And you could see that there are lots of open issues here in terms of practical implementation, how it's going to be applied in practice. And we have different network topologies, different type of deployments across European Union. So it's expected, BEREC is required to issue guidelines within 2 years where it would define the first concentration point and how many end users, how many connections are viable from the perspective, given the national context for that access point. So that was about symmetric access obligation. I mentioned that the remedies are meant to be more targeted, and the idea of the European Commission, the rationale for European Commission was as much as possible to support infrastructural competition. And this is why the Commission was, from the very beginning in its earlier proposals, it was emphasizing as the main remedy, as the central access remedy, access to civil engineering, meaning duct access, which should enable other alternative operators to get access to SMP operators' ducts, cabinets, masts, to lower the deployment cost. And essentially, in the very beginning, the Commission was proposing that the regulators should only impose other access obligations if they consider the duct access alone not sufficient. Then this text was slightly watered down in the context of negotiations over the code, so now the wording is slightly different. So basically, its duct access remains as one of the possible remedies, but not the only one. And the text goes as it vaguely suggests that NRAs should consider whether duct access alone would be sufficient. But as you could see, it's much softer wording. So would it bring much change in the context of existing regimes? We don't know. But as you know, some of the European member states, they have this regime in place already. So there are countries like Portugal or France, where, for example, active access over incumbents' fiber networks was never regulated, and the regulator has focused on regulating access to ducts. And in Portugal, it was a rather successful story because it contributed to development of alternative fiber networks. Now, another, probably the most controversial part of the code is about co-investment. And the idea with this article, with the provisions contained in Article 76, was that it should be possible to create incentives for deployment of very high-capacity networks by allowing competitors to share risk with the incumbent operators. And then as the result, it would be possible for national regulators to remove some of the regulatory obligations from the SMP. This regime could be applied subject to binding co-investment agreements made by the SMP operators and subject to condition that the SMP operator already has achieved an upfront agreement, co-investment agreement, with at least one potential co-investor, with at least one alternative operator willing to share the risk. What does it mean? What kind of agreements are we talking about? Well, it's essentially either co-ownership of those deployments or some kind of co-financing or long-term purchasing agreements that give rise to specific rights of a structural character. So you can't just contribute financially. You need to have some more rights in terms of controlling over this infrastructure, sharing the deployment risk, taking the investment decisions. So that's sort of that type of agreements. What is actually a very high capacity network? It's a very new concept. It's completely new to the code. And in this context, the code defines this as electronic communications network that consists of optical fiber elements up to the end user premises or base station, or if not, then it should be if it's a different type of technology, then it should be capable of delivering similar network performance. Well, as you can see, it's still a bit vague. So it will be the task of BEREC to define specifically what constitutes the very high capacity network. What are the criteria for co-investment offers that the incumbents the SMP operators would have to make public, that they have to be made available for alternative operators willing to co-invest? They should be open throughout the lifetime of the network. They should be open to any service provider or network provider, and they should be made public at least 6 months before the actual deployment takes place. They should be sustainable, meaning they should be fair, reasonable, non-discriminatory. Co-investors should be able to access the full capacity of the network. What I find the most controversial part of it, and that was also subject to a lot of debates while it was still in the process of adoption, it should enable flexible participation. What does it mean? That actually co-investors, they should be able to join this kind of agreements at any point in time, and they could contribute also with any value, so that's not necessarily to the full geographic extent of the network. And as you can imagine, depending on the scope of your participation as a co-investor, it effectively reflects on your risks as well. So it's not quite equal share, and for regulators it would be very difficult to assess how it should be reflected in the co-investment conditions offered to different co-investors that are joining at different points of time or a different scope of the project. Reciprocal rights for co-investment. And finally, what about non-participants? What about competitors, alternative operators that have been relying on wholesale access to SMP's network before the deployment took place, and who are not willing to participate, who are not willing to share the risks through co-investment? Well, from the start, they should be able to access to the very high capacity network on non-discriminatory terms, and initially they should be guaranteed to have access to the same type of products, to the same type of capacity products as they had before the deployment took place. But then over the time, they may also have benefit from higher capacity products. So it's also one of the controversial aspects, because how it would be fit within the picture of other co-investors, and how it would be reflected on the pricing, all other aspects, well, it would be a difficult task for regulators to decide if they follow down that path. And then, once this offer was prepared, it should be subject to the market test. So it should be put up for public consultation. Potential co-investors or access seekers who are not part of co-investment, they may propose changes, and the SMP has a chance to revise its proposals. Then it should apply for a minimum of 7 years as binding commitments with a possible extension. And as I already said, the Commission has a possibility to block this type of proposal if BEREC agrees, subject to double lock veto mechanisms. And then, what is the most striking, after going through this whole procedure, if the national regulator concludes later on that this measure is still not sufficient to address competition problems, the regulator may still impose further SMP obligations. Right? So I'm not saying that it's totally impossible, but it looks rather difficult. Remains to be seen how many national regulators would actually apply this provision in practice. Now, wholesale-only networks. The code also provides for a possibility of a lighter regulatory treatment for wholesale-only network. What does it mean? It means that a company, an undertaking that doesn't have any activities in the retail market. And this applies not just to a single company, but as a group as a whole. So actually, if to qualify as a wholesale-only network, you cannot be part of the group that has retail activities. That's sort of at this stage, we are not aware of any SMP operator in European Union who would actually meet those criteria. We do have separate wholesale companies, but they're normally part of the group that has retail activities. But basically, once we have those wholesale-only companies with SMP obligations, they could be subject to lighter regulatory treatment. So access obligations, SMP obligations would be limited to just to access, non-discrimination, and possibly fair and reasonable pricing. And this type of companies, they also could be exempted from symmetric obligations that I discussed earlier. On flexible NGA pricing, I wouldn't go in details on that because it's essentially, it's the principles that you already have in Iceland applied in practice to incumbent company Mila, and that's pretty much a possibility to remove price control from fiber subject to conditions of equivalence of access, and it's in line with the principle of 2013 recommendation on NGA. Effectively, you do have this regime already in place. It's just that the European Commission now encoded it. So in Article 74, it provides explicitly for a possibility for regulators not to impose price control cost orientation obligation on SMP, subject to certain conditions, including economic replicability test. Geographical service, it's something which should enable regulators which actually requires a regulator to make service of broadband networks. First, they have to do it by 2023 and then update every 3 years. They collect information from market players about existing broadband networks. It may include also forecast deployment, specifically very high capacity network deployment. And the purpose is for regulators to identify those areas where, for example, nobody planned any deployment, and then the possibility to request, to inquire operators who are possibly interested to do deployments there, and then they would have regulatory certainty in the sense that nobody else would be going and invest in those areas. And also, having this information should enable regulators to consider imposing, for example, specific coverage obligations in spectrum licenses, or, for example, address those areas, undeserved areas, in the context of universal service obligations. So that's the idea, that regulators should have this tool to monitor the development and then apply very targeted tools to those areas to ensure connectivity of those undeserved areas. On spectrum, that was another aspect. The European Commission was arguing that Europe is lagging behind the rest of the world on LTE deployment because the lack of coordination, the way national authorities, national governments are still treating spectrum as their sovereign resource, and they're not always complying with the plans of the European Commission to release and ensuring access to spectrum for mobile broadband at the same time. So there was an idea to give Commission more powers to coordinate national spectrum assignments, for example. And on other aspects, there was provisions on license duration and possibility for BEREC to screen all the proposed national assignment measures and require national regulators to adopt more consistent approach to amend their assignment measures. Well, those provisions were largely watered down. They were contested by member states. And what we have, minimum license duration, instead of originally proposed 25 years by European Commission, it was now reduced to 15 plus possible extension of 5 years, so effectively 20 years minimum license duration. And the peer review is entirely voluntary. So it would be done not by BEREC, but the RSPG, by another body, and Radio Spectrum Policy Group at the EU level, and its opinion is entirely non-binding, and only if it's willing to provide any opinion. But some successes on spectrum, they were achieved nevertheless. So, for example, 5G Pioneer spectrum bands, they have to be made available by end 2020, which is a bit ambitious if you say that those provisions we're talking about, they have to be implemented by national regulators. The code, the deadline we have for transposition of the code is actually also end of 2020. Yeah. So, easier rollout of small cells, also some provisions. I think, yes, it's a more on, you will have the slides, so you could go through this. It's quite extensive, so I have no intention to go through all of these changes. Maybe just to say one final aspect on universal service, which could be interesting in the Icelandic context. Because it's the first time when the European Commission has explicitly included adequate broadband service as part of the universal service. So the regime and the code, it shortens, it simplifies, it removes some legacy services such as payphones, directories from the scope of universal service, but it puts an emphasis on affordable, adequate broadband internet access. What does it imply in practice? That national member states, they have to define what constitutes affordable broadband internet access in the national context, essentially setting the minimum broadband speeds, and then securing affordability through various measures. And up to a certain extent, for next 3 years, member states may consider still applying the scope of legacy, other legacy services that they have been removed now, but then they have to justify it in the context of national conditions. So this is in brief on adequate broadband access. And in terms of next steps, where we are now, member states have to transpose it in the national law by 21st of December 2020. As I mentioned, there is a whole range of implementing measures. BEREC has to adopt guidelines on 14 topics. European Commission has to issue secondary implementing acts on at least 13 topics. And there is a whole range of the review scheduled later on. So end-user rights will be reviewed by December 2021. BEREC mandate will be reviewed by 2023 and then has to be revisited every 5 years. And a general review of the whole regulatory framework is envisaged by December 2025. So that's in brief. I leave you, there are some other details in the presentation, you can keep it. And my colleague Matej will now specifically address the institutional aspects of the code, which changes the role of BEREC to some extent and the role of RSPG, as I mentioned.